Okay, so I'm not gonna lie, I really find it very interesting to watch this video and just react to it. So I'm just gonna do it. I haven't watched it at all. So let's see. It seems interesting. Why news were so neutral in the 50s and 60s? Um, I mean, this is the perfect time to talk about this, or at least to question, like, why, right? I don't even know. I didn't live in this 50s or 60s, and went I haven't really went gone too far into the rabbit hole of history of news, in the 60s or 50s. And right now it's Monday, 17th of February of 2025. As we all know, nowadays, basically, the traditional media news um, are liars in a lot of things and are basically, just pushing narratives all over the place. And, it's a little bit obvious when you really think about it because you have like the owners of these media companies, and obviously each one of them have like their own ideologies or their own stuff that they think about the world or how they think about the world, and that obviously um, influence through all the news that they own. So it's actually very interesting to see because um, one will thought that this was much more um, common on the traditional news before, because before there were not much more. There was not freedom basically. There was not a Twitter or X. There was not YouTube. There was not the internet did not exist. Um, the internet didn't exist, so you really the only way for you to get informed was through these news around this time. So it's actually interesting, or at least the clickbait of this video is very interesting. I don't even know what clickbait is. What is clickbait? Okay, yeah, yeah. So it's clickbait because essentially it's designed to attract attention. I thought it was something that attracted attention, and then it was not true, but that's not the case. Um, yeah, the clickbait of this thing really attract my attentions. So let's watch this. Okay, you cannot see my face. I'm just gonna watch it like this.
This is the New York Times from 1962. This is the New York Times. This is the New York.
1962. It says Niels Bohr is dead at 77, pioneering the exploring the atom. This was November 19 of 1962. De Gaulle wins landslide lead in French boat. Senator Chavez is dead. Long served New Mexico. Party black, Khrushchev in red bloc within Cuba. Indians retreat as Chinese press massive attack. All the news that's fit to print. The New York Times.
Times from 1962. This is the New York Times.
Now, U.S. pushes allies for Ukraine arms as war escalates. Terror in frontline villages under constant fire. All companies watching profit fear opening.
From 2022. This is the CBS Evening News from 1952.
And a very good evening, everybody, coast to coast.
This is the CBS Evening News from 2022.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us.
There's a widespread idea that the older news from the 50s and 60s came from a sort of golden age, where the news was delivered straight without any kind of political bias. So is it true? The answer I found is actually yeah, kind of. In the 50s and 60s, cultural, technological, and political forces came together to create a unique moment in time that this video is going to explore. Along the way, we're going to talk about the rise of television, Joe McCarthy, 60s radicals, and even a bit of Ronald Reagan. To set the scene, we're going to start with a quote from the 1920s, which says, "It is often very illuminating to ask yourself how you got at the facts upon which you base your opinion.
It is often very illuminating to ask yourself how you got at the facts upon which you base your opinion.
Who actually saw, heard, felt, counted, named the thing about which you have an opinion? Was it the man who told you, or the man who told him, or someone still further removed? And how much was he permitted to see? Walter Lippmann from Public Opinion, 1922. World War I taught sobering lessons to intellectuals of the 1920s. Nations on both sides of the conflict heavily propagandized their own citizens, each side convincing their own public that they were existentially threatened by cartoonish villains on the other side. Through that process, nations were able to send seemingly endless soldiers to their front lines, each side fighting in their own version of reality. The propaganda worked so well that the fighting became difficult to stop, making the war longer and more deadly than it otherwise probably would have been. So emerging from the haze and the confusion of World War I was this new generation of intellectuals, with Walter Lippmann probably being the most famous, that were especially concerned with this ability to manipulate the public and the concerns that posed for the social order. At the same time, there was this new technology developing that seemed especially suited to do that manipulation, which was the radio. Radio was a compelling
Nuclear bombs. I was thinking about nuclear bombs. Oh my god.
suited to do that manipulation, which was the radio. Radio was a compelling technology, which meant that relatively few people, the people who owned radio stations, could reach a huge audience, which meant that they had a potentially huge influence that could
About, like, they literally had incredible power because there were no radio, like there were not a lot of radio companies, right? Or radio stations. I don't know how you tell. Like literally, one radio station could reach millions and millions and millions. So imagine the power of that.
be used nefariously and without accountability. These days we have the internet, so if the government or maybe news organizations lie to us or misrepresent something, citizens can go on social media and maybe upload a video to show us what's actually happening. So that's not perfect, but it's at least some kind of check against centralized power. But people at the time didn't have that, so to a greater extent they had to trust what they heard on the news. That meant that those who were in charge of delivering news at the time had a lot of power. They had a lot of power in telling the public what was happening in the world. And even through subtle manipulations, like using certain words or omitting certain facts, they could shape how the public felt about those things. So that brought out a concern for democracy. And from that came a doctrine of social responsibility, especially when it came to those who were in charge of delivering the news. One manifestation of that doctrine of social responsibility came from the government. In order to promote free thinking among the public and a more stable democracy, people thought the government needed the ability to regulate big corporations, and in this case, news organizations, in case they behaved irresponsibly. So that shaped the Radio Act of 1927, which gave the government the power to grant or revoke licenses to operate on radio waves based on how stations fell within the public interest, public convenience, or public necessity. It's questionable how useful that clause of the Radio Act actually was, or how often it was actually enforced. But it set the stage for what happened with television about 20 years later. So, let's get to that. By the end of the 40s, television was entering mass production and was becoming affordable for average American households. It was clearly a more compelling technology than radio, and was clearly set to be the next big thing in terms of popularity and influence. And again, the same concerns were posed, that a few people owning a few corporations, 3 to be exact, CBS, NBC, and ABC, would have huge influence in shaping public opinion, influence that could be used irresponsibly. So again, it was thought that the preservation of democracy depended on a responsible press. Regulators at the FCC used the Radio Act of 1927 as a precedent to also regulate television. So if broadcasters wanted to be granted a license to operate on publicly owned airwaves, they had to demonstrate that they included programming that was in the public interest. The FCC also implemented the Fairness Doctrine in 1949, which said that stations had to dedicate some of their time to controversial matters of public interest, and while doing it, show both sides of
Like, if you really think about it, the best thing is the internet. Because it's so difficult right now. No, it's not so difficult, but it's so easy. Well, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. The internet is a double-edged sword now to think about it. Because, yeah, you can actually find the truth, or it's more likely for you to find the truth about a lot of things, a lot of issues. But then also, it's more likely to find, like fake news, right? So that's, it's a trade at the end of the day. And I think that trade, even if you have a lot of fake news, I think that trade is compelling to make because at the end of the day, you have the freedom of, actually finding or at least being closer to the truth. Now, obviously, for you to find it or being closer to the truth, you need to be able to have like the abilities, right? Like the reasoning abilities or, abilities that allow you to get closer to the truth, like critical thinking, right? But yeah, like the internet has facilitated that a lot. So that's great. More freedom.
of the issue. So that was a lot of exposition to set us up for this moment. So we're now leaving the 40s and entering the 50s. Technology was maturing.
I'm gonna put it like this. Doesn't matter. It's because you cannot see me. Why you cannot see? What the hell? This is so strange. There you go. Cine memo. This is what I wanted. Great.
And productions coming from these stations were cutting edge for their time. But there was this public interest requirement from the FCC that the station owners were anxious to be in compliance with. And the way they did it was through their news programs. They essentially created non-profit news programs. So news programs at the time typically took losses, and shareholders understood that it was required in order for the stations to stay on air. Which means, if you're following what I'm saying, that we had a new, exciting medium, which was fascinating huge audiences and creating news that was curated to the highest standards of the time. And those news programs weren't expected to make any money. So then you might ask, if the news at the time wasn't shaped by profit-seeking principles, then what principles did shape the news? And pretty much everyone from the main three networks will give you the same answer, and that's some sort of version of the doctrine of social responsibility. Within the profession, it meant following a code of ethical journalism. Here's Walter Cronkite, arguably the biggest anchor from the time period, giving his version of it. The video is low quality, so I'm just going to play it on screen here.
Never had to give an opinion, never wanted to give an opinion, never had any desire to be an editorialist.
By the way, he's talking about how rare and uncomfortable it was for him to give his famous editorial on the Vietnam War.
I thought the highest calling was to try to get the facts straight and report them impartially and fairly.
So the gold standard at the time of that doctrine, as recognized around the world, was the New York Times. So television news and news of all types around the world looked to the New York Times as a model of what professional journalism should look like. And the guiding word that the New York Times staff was practically obsessed with was objectivity. We'll get back to the New York Times in a bit. For now, I want to get back to television and show you guys some actual footage from television news at the time. So these are trying to be representative of average clips from the era, but within that, they're clips where you'd normally expect to find bias. This first clip is from 1968. It's the first clip I found where a commentator goes back and forth between describing opposing points of view. In this case, it was opposing points of view within the Republican Party at the RNC of 1968. One politician, John Lindsay, was trying to push the Republican Party towards the left, and another politician, Ronald Reagan, was trying to push the Republican Party towards the right. So this is how the commentator delivers that story.
We had the division today very dramatically. Mayor Lindsay of New York thinks that society in general is responsible for the plight of the poor. Governor Reagan suggests that the individual himself is more responsible. Poverty is a chief cause of crime and violence, according to the mayor. The governor very much doubts that. Mr. Lindsay emphasizes social justice. The governor emphasizes social order. Mr. Lindsay is a dove on the war, but he does not advocate unilateral withdrawal from Vietnam. Governor Reagan is a hawk on the war, but he does not say exactly how we should hit the enemy harder.
Notice that he doesn't use words that are emotionally loaded. He describes in simple terms
A hawk on the war, but he does not say exactly how we should hit the enemy harder.
Notice that he doesn't use words
Unilateral withdrawal from Vietnam.
He said,
Ronald Reagan points of view. The clip I found where a commentator went bias. This first clip is from 1968. It's the first clip I found where a commentator goes back and forth between describing opposing points of view.
okay, in that case, you just said that it's the first clip.
The first clip I found where a commentator goes back and forth. The clip is from 1968. Than that, they're clips where you'd normally expect to find bias. This first clip is from 1968. It's the first clip I found where a commentator goes back and forth between.
You know, that statement is a little bit strange because you're saying it's the first clip that I found where a commentator was saying that. Do you mean the first clip that I found on the year 1968 or from all history? If it's from 1968, then is it really true that the news were neutral around that time? Because if there was just one video that you just found, I mean, there's a lot of things. Maybe, I mean, obviously we're talking about the 60s. It's not like all the freaking news were recorded and uploaded to YouTube or something or to the internet. So maybe he's referring to that, right? Obviously, it's very difficult to find videos from the television. Like, it's not like everyone recorded. You know what I mean? Yeah. So
between describing opposing points of view. In this, the Republican
For the plight of the poor. Poverty is a chief cause of crime and violence, according to the mayor. The governor very much doubts that. Mr. Lindsay emphasizes social justice. The governor emphasizes social order. Mr. Lindsay is a dove on the war, but he does not advocate unilateral withdrawal from Vietnam. Governor Reagan is a hawk on the war, but he does not say exactly how we should hit the enemy harder.
Notice that he doesn't use words that are emotionally loaded. He describes in simple terms the positions of each side, and even highlights a potential flaw on each side. He says that one candidate is a dove, but doesn't actually advocate for withdrawal, and the other candidate is a hawk, but doesn't articulate how their policy would be different from what they're already doing. So he's giving the audience the information they need to think for themselves about this story, and he's doing it in a way where that can actually plausibly happen. I'm going to play a clip now from the beginning of the TV news era, from 1950. This is the anchor talking about various bills and their likelihood to pass in Congress. Again, listen to the choice of words and to the tone of his voice, and try to figure out what the anchor's opinion is.
Here are some of the main proposals. Proposals to balance the budget by increasing taxes. Mr. Truman asked unsuccessfully for those taxes last year. Now again, the report is increased taxes are unlikely to pass. Instead, Congress will aim to revise the entire federal tax structure. Speaker Rayburn said that this afternoon. Another plan, expansion of the Social Security law. It would increase benefits to retired workers. It's considered certain to pass since this is an election year. One of the hottest issues is civil rights legislation. Anti-lynching and other bills to protect the rights of minority groups are unlikely to pass. The Southern Bloc is expected to filibuster. To protect the nation's tenants, continuation of rent control is proposed. Strong arguments from tenants and landlords. Action uncertain.
I don't know about you, but I thought that was remarkably unbiased. He uses this formal, controlled cadence with his voice that makes it remarkably hard to tell what he actually thinks. So my point here is that this is what you could expect from the TV news of the era. So to round the section out, I'm going to play one more clip. This is of Walter Cronkite delivering George Wallace's election results. George Wallace was a pro-segregation third-party candidate in 1968, who actually did surprisingly well for a third-party candidate. I'm actually not sure what Walter Cronkite's opinions were, but I'm guessing that he wasn't a fan of George Wallace, and I'm guessing that he was against segregation. So I saw this as a moment that might have been difficult for him to keep his emotions out of, and maybe tempting to put his bias into. So with that in mind, let's see how Walter Cronkite delivers.
Seems like I'm like literally so bored, but I'm not. Like I'm just very tired. I didn't sleep at all. That's it.
The news.
In electoral votes, George Wallace carried only 5 deep South states, but he piled up the largest number of popular votes of any third-party candidate in history. And in that, he said, he considered his candidacy successful. His reaction to the outcome came at a news conference in Montgomery, Alabama.
Of course, I
want to draw your attention to 5 things. 1 is that they bothered to cover George Wallace at all. 2, they covered probably the 2 most important parts of the story, that Wallace lost, but also that he did surprisingly well for a third-party candidate. The 3rd thing is that they bothered to inform the audience that he won the most popular votes of any third-party candidate in American history. 4th, they even cut to George Wallace to let him react to the results. The 5th thing is that they did the whole thing in unemotional language. They didn't try to tell the viewer how to feel about it. And Cronkite also delivered the story, I would say, remarkably neutrally. To my ear, he started the bit sounding a little bit annoyed.
In electoral votes, George Wallace carried only 5 deep South states.
But then he recovered and delivered the rest of the segment pretty neutrally.
But he piled up the largest number of popular votes of any third-party candidate in history. And in that, he said, he considered his candidacy successful.
So when Cronkite says,
I thought the highest calling was to try to get the facts straight and report them impartially and fairly.
To me, that doesn't ring hollow. I can watch his footage and actually see what he was talking about, even with a subject like George Wallace. And again, the New York Times was the institution that was largely responsible for setting those standards in journalism at the time. Since the New York Times is obviously a newspaper, they controlled their bias by controlling their writing style. So the New York Times developed a heavily controlled writing style. They stripped out any language that was emotionally manipulative, and instead they chose phrasing that was as neutral as possible. And they also didn't interpret anything, because interpreting things would mean putting their own opinion into it. So they just tried to report factually on what was happening in the world in as neutral language as possible. Here's the paper from 1962 again. This is just a random paper I bought from the time period, so there's nothing special about it. If you look at the headlines on the first page, you should be able to see the neutral style I was just talking about. I'll read a few. Indians retreat as Chinese press massive attack. That right there is already a good example. Niels Bohr is dead at 77. Pioneer in exploring atom. McCloy resumes Cuba discussions with some Russian name. The articles themselves are written in a similar style, which I'm not going to read for the sake of not boring us. But there's one headline in particular on the second page that caught my eye that I want to draw our attention to. This is about Nikita Khrushchev announcing a new economic policy. So consider the context here. This is in the middle of the Cold War, and this is an American paper writing about Soviet economic policy. So consider the possibilities to spin that. Headlines you could write that would even in subtle ways make the Soviet policy look bad. So really the possibilities are endless there, even a headline like Khrushchev tries again. So with that in mind, this is the headline that the New York Times chose. Khrushchev set to chart economic course. I personally think that's incredible. To me, that headline is like the epitome of neutrality. This is why people looked up to the New York Times so much. This is probably a good time to say that the most blatant bias that I saw in TV news at the time was precisely in that regard. So TV news didn't try to be neutral when it came to communism abroad. They were blatantly pro-American and anti-communist. If you remember the clip from the beginning of the video.
And a very good evening, everybody, coast to coast.
This is how the anchor begins that show.
The communists over in Korea have been yelling quite a bit lately, louder than usual too, rejecting the final truce proposals for one thing, filibustering during the meetings, charging that General Colson openly admitted that there has been bloodshed at Koji and that the prisoners there could expect humane treatment in the future. As a matter of fact, that's what Colson did say, but as his superior puts it, that was a statement secured by unadulterated blackmail.
But this is the same anchor that delivered this news, where it was so hard to tell what he actually thought.
Strong arguments from tenants and landlords. Action uncertain.
So when we're calling the news at the time unbiased, we're calling it unbiased within the spectrum of mainstream American values. Journalists from the major 3 networks and from the New York Times tried for the most part to give Americans news they could consume without feeling disrespected, that gave them the information they needed without being manipulated. I think this is all leading to a question that goes something like, well, okay, if that was how the news was in the 50s and 60s, then why isn't the news like that anymore? In my opinion, this is where things get really interesting. So I'm going to answer it, but this is kind of a bonus, so I'm going to pick up the pace just a little bit. A good place to start is with Joe McCarthy.
Those who would destroy this nation will go on and on.
Joe McCarthy made claims in the 50s about a widespread communist conspiracy in America, in large part without evidence. It was thought at the time that the duty of the press was to report what politicians said without challenging it. So that's what the news did. They reported what McCarthy said without challenging it, with the notable exception of Edward R. Murrow. Once McCarthy fell and his lack of evidence became clear, people started to look at the press as being complicit in McCarthy's rise to power. So that episode made the gears start turning in the heads of a lot of journalists. They started to think that they had to start calling a lie, which meant journalists might take less of a passive, dead center approach to their work, and more of an active approach that picked sides if they thought the facts lined up with that side. The 60s and the 70s brought in influence from the left. By the 70s, journalism degrees had become popular and were becoming a requirement if you wanted to work for a prestigious news organization. And the universities producing these degrees leaned left, making these news networks increasingly fill with left-leaning people over time. It was also an especially radical time to be on campus. Campus radicals at the time felt an overriding urge to change society as soon as possible, and they saw objectivity as an obstacle to that. So they saw objectivity as a form of complicity with the establishment, and they started arguing for a version of journalism that looked more like activism. And those types of voices started to gain traction in news networks. By the end of the 60s, the writing of the New York Times had shifted enough for the managing editor to write this memo to his staff. Although, to be clear, he exaggerates in it to make a point. I get the impression, reading the Times, that the image we give of America is largely of demonstrations, discrimination, anti-war movements, rallies, protests, etc. Obviously, all these things are an important part of the American scene. But I think that because of our own liberal interest, and because of our reporters' inclination, we overdo this. I am not suggesting eliminating any one of these stories. I am suggesting that reporters and editors look a bit more around them to see what is going on in other fields, and to try to make an effort to represent other shades of opinion than those held by the new left, the old left, the middle-aged left, and the anti-war people. Here's a random New York Times from 2022. Looking at the headlines, you should be able to see that the neutral writing style isn't really there anymore. I'll read out, I think, the 2 most emotional headlines. Terror in frontline villages under constant fire. Oil companies awash in profit, fear opening spigot for Europe. While I was making this, I found a discarded New York Times in front of my building that I thought would be fun to pick up and feature as a second data point. This was its lead story. American Nationalist: How Tucker Carlson Stoked White Fear to Conquer Cable News. So if you hear somebody say that the older New York Times wasn't neutral, or that it hasn't changed, there's some comparison for you. Getting back to television, a big shakeup happened when 60 Minutes was produced, which blended the concepts of news and entertainment, which helped it become, by 1978, the highest rated show on TV. That, combined with new competition from cable networks like CNN, made higher-ups at CBS, NBC, and ABC start to think that their news division's nonprofit approach was starting to look stale. By the early 80s, the networks demanded that their news divisions do the unthinkable: make money. That was facilitated by Ronald Reagan, who, believing that things were better shaped by market forces, set up an FCC that was disdainful of the public interest requirement, and that repealed the Fairness Doctrine. It's questionable how directly useful the FCC regulation ever was, but in my research, it seemed to function similar to having speed limits posted on the side of the road. Having speed limits posted, combined with having officers out there that could conceivably enforce those limits, reliably makes drivers drive more responsibly. And I think it was the same for the broadcast networks. Just knowing that the regulation could be enforced made them try to make more socially responsible content. Basically, the news got hit from all sides. They got hit from the activist left that saw objectivity as a form of complicity, and they got hit from the right who deregulated the FCC. And they got hit from within their own industry, which moved news in the direction of entertainment, which made them increasingly have to make news based on audience demands and not journalistic principles. And no, those two things are not necessarily synonymous. But there was a time when journalists had freer rein to shape the news, and when objectivity was seen as the loftiest goal that a journalist could have, and bosses let journalists shape the news according to that goal. And that was in the 50s and the 60s. So I'd say that this is a myth that, for the most part, checks out. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Oh my god. That was quick. Man, I got so tired right now. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, you know what? I really think a lot of it is about like incentives, because strange how he said that back in the day they or this new, these big media companies didn't really make money at all, and once you insert money into the equation, companies maybe like, and